Hi, I'm Carl Weber. Welcome to Video Aided Instructions series on how to write a great research paper. In this program, we'll be tackling one of the more challenging aspects of writing a research paper: when and how to incorporate your research findings into your work. Years ago, the first time I taught a class in which a research paper was assigned, I made a big mistake. I foolishly assumed that my students understood the basic philosophy of research, why you would want to study what other thinkers have written about a topic, and how to use what you learn to construct an argument of your own. Since I took this for granted, I didn't spend much time explaining it, and when I received the first draft of my students' papers, I was shocked. Some of them did understand, but many of them didn't. For example, some students seemed to think that a research paper was simply a collection of other people's ideas. They turned in papers that were simply excerpts from books and articles they'd read, each introduced with a sentence of their own. So I'd open the paper and I'd read, "Jones wrote the following about Melville," followed by a paragraph quoted from a source. Then I would read, "Smith, however, wrote this about Melville," followed by another paragraph from a different source. The entire paper would continue this way, and by the end of the 10 pages, I probably read no more than 100 words written by the student who supposedly had written the paper. All the rest of the contents were simply excerpts from things they'd read. This is not what a research paper is supposed to be. A research paper is, above all, an essay by you that reflects your ideas about the topic. Now, ideas, information, and sometimes quotations from source materials that you've read will be used in the paper. But the building you're constructing is your own work built according to your design. It just contains an occasional brick borrowed from another person's building. Fortunately, I was able to fix my mistake in that class from years ago. I gathered the students and spent a session or two explaining what research is really all about, and they were able to rework their compositions into real research papers. And that's a problem you won't have since you're watching this program. The mistake my students made isn't the only one that students make when they're trying to write their first real research papers. There's a real art to interweaving borrowed materials with your own writing and making the finished product your own, with your own voice, style, attitude, and organization. And in this program, we'll consider the most important principles of that art. Over the last few weeks, you've learned a lot about your topic, everything from dozens of specific factual details to big sweeping ideas and theories that tie all those facts together into general arguments. Now, if you've taken good notes during your research following the suggestions that we provided in this series, you can probably trace most or all of what you've learned back to specific sources: books, articles, web pages, government documents, and other texts where you encountered the facts and ideas in the first place. But not everything you've learned from your research needs to be cited and mentioned in your paper. Some facts and ideas can be simply discussed without referring to a source. But how do you distinguish what needs to be cited from what doesn't? Here are some rules to follow. First, information that is common knowledge doesn't need to be cited. Now, what is common knowledge? This term doesn't only refer to information that you and your friends all know, although that, of course, would be included under the heading of common knowledge. It also includes any information that could be easily obtained from many sources and that is not open to dispute or to varying interpretations. Here are some examples of items that could be considered common knowledge: the dates of historical events, the birth and death dates of famous people, and basic scientific, historic, and cultural facts such as, for example, the number of feet in a mile, the distance from the Earth to the Sun, the names of the people who have served as President of the United States, the location of Easter Island, and the identity of the author of Don Quixote. Any of these facts could be looked up in 100 reference books or 1,000 websites, and there would never be any disagreement as to the exact nature of those facts. So those are considered common knowledge, and if you refer to them in your paper, you don't need to name or cite a source. On the other hand, some facts that might be basic common knowledge under other circumstances may be open to dispute in certain specific situations. In this case, when there is strong disagreement about the nature of certain facts, you need to decide which version of the facts you intend to accept for your paper, briefly explain the basis for your choice in the paper, and cite the source or sources that you're relying upon. So just because something might fall into the category of a basic fact doesn't necessarily mean it is common knowledge that doesn't have to be cited. Here's an example. Suppose you're writing a paper for an English literature class in which the date when Shakespeare wrote a particular play is important. For example, you might want to argue that the symbolism in Shakespeare's play Othello is based in part on some contemporary event. In other words, something that happened in English history during the Elizabethan era when Shakespeare lived. You want to say in your paper that there are references to this event in the play Othello. And to demonstrate this, of course, you would need to show that the play Othello was written around the time of that contemporary event, or at least shortly thereafter. Obviously, Othello couldn't have been written before the event to which it apparently refers. Therefore, for this particular paper, the date when Shakespeare wrote the play Othello really matters. Now, it so happens that scholars and historians have different opinions about when each of the plays of Shakespeare was written. There is no hard factual evidence to demonstrate which timeline is correct. Shakespeare didn't leave behind a diary in which he described when he wrote each play, and we don't have firm publishing information or firm information about the first dates when each of the plays was produced. So there's a lot of argument as to when Shakespeare wrote each of his plays, including Othello. And this is a fact that you would probably have gathered quickly through your research. You begin reading about Shakespeare and how he wrote the plays, and you quickly discover that different scholars have different opinions as to when the plays were written. So, when you write your paper, you can't treat the date when Othello was written as common knowledge. Instead, you'll have to include in your paper a paragraph in which you say something like, I accept Professor so-and-so's theory about the date of Othello, based on the fact that her theory best accounts for the current evidence about when the play was first performed, and so on. You would explain in this paragraph why you think Professor so-and-so is right about the date of Othello, and why other professors and scholars who disagree with Professor so-and-so are wrong. In this paragraph, you would include a reference to the article or book by Professor so-and-so in which she laid out her theory about the date of Othello. So as you can see, although deciding what is common knowledge, generally agreed upon and widely accessible, is usually fairly obvious, in some cases it requires judgment and knowledge. So thinking carefully about what is and isn't common knowledge in your field is important in deciding what kind of information needs a reference citation and what kind doesn't. You also need to provide citations for facts that may not be subject to dispute, but that are little known and come from a specific source. Suppose, for example, that you're writing about the life and work of the naturalist Charles Darwin and tracing the story of how and when he decided to publish his theory of evolution, one of the most important breakthroughs in modern science. Now, you wouldn't need to cite a source for certain well-known facts about Darwin and the theory of evolution. For example, the dates of Darwin's voyage aboard the Beagle, which was a journey around the world that exposed Darwin to plant and animal species from several continents and played a pivotal role in shaping his thinking, these dates, you wouldn't need to cite a source for them. Hundreds of thousands of historians, biographers, and scholars have written about Darwin's travels. The voyage of the Beagle has gone down in history as one of the most famous scientific adventures of all time, and there's no dispute about the dates of this trip. So if you were going to refer in your paper to Darwin's journey on the Beagle, you wouldn't have to cite a specific source as to the date when that trip began. But suppose you decided, based on your research, that Darwin's decision to delay the publication of his theory was heavily influenced by some specific conversation he had sometime in the 1840s. And this is a conversation that's not talked about in all of the standard biographies of Darwin, but it's one that you learned about when you read one of his diaries. Now, you would be getting out of the realm of common knowledge. You'd be getting into a fact that is somewhat little known and which your teacher would probably want to know Well, what is the source for the information about this particular conversation? I never heard of it. I need to know that the student has based this on some solid background information. So when describing this conversation in your paper, you would need to cite your source for this information, the particular diary or other source that you relied upon in describing the conversation. This wouldn't qualify as common knowledge, unlike such basic facts as the dates of the journey on the Beagle. So you need to know something about your field in order to help you determine what is and isn't common knowledge. Generally speaking, opinions and interpretations of facts that you might borrow from other writers will always need a source citation. Now, how do you distinguish an opinion or an interpretation from a fact? Here's a rule of thumb. A fact is an event in the real world that practically everyone can point to and agree upon. By contrast, an opinion or an interpretation adds a personal spin or attitude or feeling to the real world event, and not everyone will agree upon that spin, attitude, or feeling. So opinions and interpretations are open to dispute, whereas facts generally are not. Here's a classic example of the difference between a fact and an opinion, which was first offered by the scholar Jacques Barzun in his book on the art of research. It's a fact that the President of the United States, James Garfield, was fatally shot by a man named Charles Guiteau on July 2nd, 1881. This is an event that happened in the real world, and everyone agrees upon it. You can point to specific factual evidence, such as newspaper accounts, that make it clear exactly what happened on that date, and that Charles Guiteau was the one holding the gun, that James Garfield was shot, and that he ultimately died of his wounds. So that's a fact. But if you were to say, in your paper, President James Garfield was assassinated by Charles Guiteau, a disappointed seeker of public office, now you're adding a layer of opinion or interpretation to the fact. And you'd be adding even more opinion or interpretation if you were to add that Garfield's murder led to the creation of the civil service system in the United States to remove job appointments from the realm of politics. Another layer of opinion or interpretation is being added to the basic fact about Garfield's assassination. Why is this so? Well, first of all, when we say that Charles Guiteau was a disappointed office seeker, we're implying a cause and effect relationship that can't actually be proved and that not everyone would necessarily agree with. We'd be implying that the reason that Guiteau murdered President Garfield was because he was disappointed in looking for a government job. We'd be implying that his attitude toward Garfield was totally shaped by that event and that that was the reason for the assassination. We're not saying it in so many words, but by linking his disappointment as an office seeker to the assassination of Garfield, we're strongly implying a cause and effect relationship. And since we can't mind read at this point, we can't look into Guiteau's mind and understand exactly what his motivation was. It might have been motivated by a number of different things. We can't say for sure that that simple cause and effect relationship exists. So even making that statement that Guiteau was a disappointed office seeker and making it in that context is adding a layer of interpretation to the facts. It might be interesting to point out that there are people who say, for example, that Guiteau was actually a little insane and that he was told by a voice in his head to murder Garfield. And there's another possible interpretation as to why the assassination took place. It might sound at first glance like it's simply a fact to say that Garfield was shot by a disappointed office seeker, but in fact there's an interpretation built into that simple sentence which goes beyond the realm of pure fact into the realm of opinion. And when we add the idea that the killing of Garfield led to the creation of civil service reform, once again we are adding another interpretation to the facts of history. As we know, most historical events are driven by more than one cause, and this is certainly true of a major piece of legislation like the creation of the civil service system. So at least it's a simplification of history to say that Garfield's assassination was the cause of the civil service idea. Undoubtedly, there had been people advocating the idea of a civil service system prior to the assassination of Garfield, and there were undoubtedly power groups for and against the idea. And so simply saying that Garfield's assassination led in a one-on-one way directly to the creation of civil service reform is certainly an oversimplification and, again, an interpretation which we're adding to the facts, not just a fact in itself. So if you were to mention the idea that civil service reform was caused by Garfield's assassination in a research paper, you'd want to give your evidence for this opinion, and you'd also want to cite any earlier writers from whom you borrowed this idea. That's an example of going beyond common knowledge and beyond facts into the realm of interpretation. And if you borrow an interpretation or an opinion of history from a writer, you want to cite the source. When you refer to an opinion or interpretation, it's generally a good idea to trace the idea to its root source, if that's possible. In other words, try to figure out who originated the idea and mention that person in your paper. This is good scholarly practice since it gives fair credit to the creator of the concept, and it also allows your readers to compare your version of the idea to the original form of the idea if he or she wants to do that. Here's an example. Let's suppose that you were writing about how Darwinian ideas of evolution have been developed in the century or more since Darwin originally proposed his theory. So in your research, you've been reading all kinds of accounts of new Darwinian thinking, how scientists in recent years have taken Darwin's ideas and modified or added to them. Now, in your reading, you may come across many references to the idea of punctuated equilibrium, which is one of the most important proposed alterations to Darwin's theory that has been developed in recent years. The idea of punctuated equilibrium is that species don't change gradually over time, but rather that they stay more or less the same for long periods of time and then go through rather sudden, rapid changes. Equilibrium, which is punctuated then by rapid, brief periods of change. It's a new approach to evolution that many scientists have espoused and that some others disagree with. Now, you may decide that in your paper you want to include a couple of paragraphs discussing how punctuated equilibrium reflects changes in the concept of evolution that are held by many biologists and showing how these changes relate back to Darwin's original theory. Now, through your research, you may have discovered that many scientists have written about punctuated equilibrium, some in favor of it, some against it, and some offering fresh takes or fresh changes to the concept of punctuated equilibrium. But when you first refer to the idea in your paper, you'll want to reference the scientists who originally developed the concept of punctuated equilibrium, not one of the many later scientists who've contributed to the debate about it. In other words, you'd like to trace the idea back to its root source. That's good scholarly practice, and it's something you should try to do whenever referring to any fact, opinion, interpretation, or theory in your paper. If your research has been thorough, you've certainly come across references to the people who first proposed punctuated equilibrium. These were two biologists known as Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould. And most of the time when scholars refer to punctuated equilibrium, they mention Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould. So with a small amount of digging, you can uncover the name of the paper in which they originally wrote about punctuated equilibrium. You can find a copy of that paper either in a hard copy in the library or online, and you can refer to that paper appropriately in your own paper. So your reference to punctuated equilibrium in the paper might read something like this. This is a paragraph from the paper that you might write. One of the most famous variations on Darwinian evolution was first proposed by Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould, parentheses 1972. Known as punctuated equilibrium, their theory suggested that evolution is most often characterized not by gradual changes in species, but by long periods of stasis, interrupted by relatively brief, rapid changes, and so on. And your paper would continue to discuss the importance of the theory of punctuated equilibrium. Notice what we've done here. We've inserted the reference to the people who first originated the idea, Eldredge and Gould, and we've given the date for their seminal paper. Using the proper bibliography format for a paper in the natural sciences, you would then, at the end of the paper, have a citation that would read like this: Eldredge N. and Gould S.J., 1972, Punctuated Equilibrium, an Alternative to Phyletic Gradualism, in Schopf, T.J.M. ed., Models in Paleontology, San Francisco, Freeman Cooper. Now, we'll be taking a much closer look at the format for citations and bibliographic references in the next program in this series. So understanding exactly why the bibliographic reference was laid out in the way it has been here is not important right now. We'll be focusing on that later. Our point here is to emphasize that when you're referring to any well-known idea that can be traced to a specific originator, it's considered scholarly to cite the original source, not some later interpreter. So if you were mentioning, for example, punctuated equilibrium, go back to Eldridge and Gould and don't cite instead some later writer who might have talked about punctuated equilibrium, because that person borrowed it from Eldridge and Gould, and the idea is to go back to the originator. On the other hand, if an opinion or interpretation is extremely obvious or very well known, it may actually shift into the realm of common knowledge. So in a few cases, opinions or interpretations that go beyond fact actually may qualify as common knowledge. And knowing exactly when this happens is quite important and takes a certain amount of judgment. In this case, it probably doesn't need to be linked to a research source. Your reading, your background research should make it clear to you which ideas in your particular field have become common knowledge in this way and which ones are not. You'll notice that there are certain ideas that are referred to over and over again by practically every writer or scholar writing about a particular topic, and that usually these ideas are not linked to any particular origin. When this happens, you've got an interpretation or an opinion that has become common knowledge and doesn't need a reference citation. Here's an example, one that we've already mentioned. It relates to Melville's novel, Moby Dick. As you probably remember, this book deals with the giant white whale, Moby Dick, and his pursuit by the obsessed Captain Ahab. Captain Ahab has lost his leg in an earlier encounter with the whale, and he's vowed revenge, and he leads his crew on a wild chase throughout the lengthy novel of Moby Dick, which ultimately ends in the destruction of everyone on board the ship, or almost everyone. Now, an obvious symbolic interpretation of this story is that the great white whale, Moby Dick, stands for any irrational obsession that a person may pursue, even to the point of his own destruction. We've all encountered people who become so obsessed with a particular goal or idea that they will chase it, even to the extent that it may ultimately cost them their lives and perhaps bring unhappiness down on themselves and all those around them. For some people, it may be fame, maybe wealth, whatever. This is the kind of symbol that the white whale stands for in the minds of many people. Now, this idea that Moby Dick stands for any great obsession is so deeply built into the book. It's so obvious in a way, and it's been written about and analyzed by so many critics and scholars in the many decades since the novel was first written, that you could treat this idea as common knowledge. It wouldn't be necessary, if you were writing about Melville, to try to find out who first stated this interpretation of Moby Dick. In fact, it would be very hard to do so, very hard to trace this idea back to an originator. It seems likely that one of the first critics who first wrote about the book when it was published back in the middle of the 19th century, one of those first critics probably mentioned the idea because, as I say, it's a pretty obvious interpretation of the novel. As you can see, deciding when a source note is needed or not needed in your paper isn't always obvious. It sometimes takes judgment as well as knowledge of what has previously been written in the field. Figuring out what is common knowledge and what isn't always easy. The basic question to ask yourself is, would someone who's reading this paper who is generally knowledgeable about the topic but not an expert, would this person find it helpful to have a source cited for the particular fact or idea that you're describing? If so, then provide the source. If they wouldn't particularly find it useful or helpful to have a source cited, then don't bother. When you're in doubt, when a particular idea seems to fall into a gray area where you're not sure whether a source citation is needed or not, go ahead and provide one. The worst thing that will happen is that your teacher will say, well, you really didn't need a footnote for that fact on page 11. Giving an extra footnote that isn't really necessary is an error, but it's a very minor scholarly error. It's much less serious than omitting a footnote that is actually necessary. So when in doubt, go ahead and provide the footnote. It's not so bad if you give an extra footnote or two that turns out not to have actually been necessary. But these are some of the rules and principles to think about when deciding what elements in your paper need footnotes and which ones don't. So far, we've been discussing when and why you need to cite research sources. Now let's look at how you cite your sources. Now, we're not going to focus here on the mechanics of footnoting and creating your bibliography. Those details are important and complicated, and we'll be devoting our entire next program in this series to that topic. Instead, we're going to focus here on how you gracefully interweave the materials from your sources into your own writing. That is, how to use ideas or information from your reading in your paper while making sure that the entire essay is in your voice and reads as a unified whole. There are 3 good ways of incorporating your research into your writing. Let's consider each one. One way to cite a source is by paraphrasing it. This means stating the information from your research in your own words, using your own style, and fitting it naturally into the flow of your essay. You would choose this form of citation, paraphrasing, whenever the idea that you're citing is more important than the precise words that are used in stating it in your source. Very often, you'll be using an idea around which your source writer built an entire essay or book chapter or even a whole book. He or she may have done extensive research and cited hundreds of sources of his or her own in building a case for this particular idea. But of course, in your paper, you don't need to recapitulate all of that work. You don't care about all the details that go into the creation of that one idea that you're going to borrow and use in your paper. Remember, you're building a structure of your own, and you just want to use your source to provide a single brick for your own building. It would be distracting and it would be a waste of space to quote a lot of detail from the source in a case like that. You just want to borrow the one key idea, fit it into your structure, and move on. And in a situation like that, paraphrasing is the best choice. Now, there are a couple of pitfalls that students fall into when they paraphrase sources. One pitfall is that they sometimes forget that a scholarly citation of the source is every bit as necessary when paraphrasing as when quoting directly. You must give credit to the person from whom you're borrowing the idea, even if you state the idea in your own words. So a footnote and or a bibliographic reference are essential, even when you paraphrase. Again, we'll be discussing the mechanics of creating footnotes and bibliographic references in the next program in this series. If you fail to do this, if you paraphrase and fail to give credit to the person from whom you're paraphrasing the content, you may be technically committing plagiarism, which means stealing someone else's work and passing it off as your own. This is actually even a crime according to the laws, although for our purpose it's more important to realize that plagiarism is a serious scholarly mistake, something that your teacher will probably be very upset about if he or she notices it, and that may lead to a failing grade on the paper or maybe in the entire course. So even when you paraphrase, cite your source for the idea and be sure to give all the necessary bibliographic information so that you're giving credit to the person from whom you borrowed the idea. The other pitfall that students fall into when paraphrasing is they fail to use their own words throughout the paraphrase. We discussed this problem in our program on note-taking. Rather than writing their own sentences stating the ideas that they're borrowing, students sometimes take sentences from the original author, tinker with them a little, change a word here and there, change a verb tense, something like that, and then they stick those sentences right into their own paper. Now, they may think that this is paraphrasing the source, but really it isn't. Instead, they're inadvertently committing a form of plagiarism. They're passing off someone else's work as their own. When you simply take a passage from a source writer, an article or a book, and make a few minor changes to it and then insert it into your paper without quotation marks, you're not paraphrasing. It's kind of like taking a painting by Picasso, touching it up with a little dab of paint here and a dab of paint there, and then signing your name in the corner. You couldn't get away with this if you were an artist, and you can't get away with the same thing as the writer of a research paper. Now, if you've been taking notes correctly, as we discussed in this series, you should be able to avoid making this mistake accidentally. Remember that when you take notes about your reading, you should quote sentences or paragraphs precisely whenever the exact wording from your source is important. when the author of the book or the article that you're interested in has stated some idea in language that's especially forceful, provocative, clear, insightful, or compelling. So when you read a research source and you come across a sentence or a paragraph that states an idea in an extremely effective way, then you want to say, great, I want to make a copy of that. And you can copy it down in your notes. When you do this, you must get every word, every spelling, and every punctuation mark right, and note exactly what page or pages from your source the quote material comes from. And of course, put quotation marks around the whole thing so that there's no way that you can forget that these words were actually drawn directly from your source, not paraphrased. On the other hand, when the exact wording from your source isn't terribly important, that is, when the language that the source writer used wasn't particularly impressive or wonderful, when it's the fact or the idea rather than the language that really matters, then paraphrasing in your notes is better than copying down whole sentences. And it's important that when you paraphrase in your notes that you thoroughly rewrite the source rather than simply changing a word or a phrase here and there. A mistake that many students make when they're taking notes is to, in effect, copy passages from their source, just changing a few words here and there, writing it down in their notes without quotation marks around it as if they made up those words, and then later stick those sentences into their paper as if they wrote them. They may even forget that they didn't write those sentences. In effect, they are now plagiarizing, even though they don't intend to do that. Students are probably more prone to this mistake today because of the ease of using the computer for research. Whenever you pull documents or quotations from the internet and create computer files that contain this material so that you can refer to the writing later for possible use in your paper, it's very easy to lose track of those files and exactly which sentences or paragraphs come from where. And if this happens to you, you may find yourself inserting sentences that another person wrote into your paper, honestly thinking that those sentences are your own work. This has even happened to some well-known scholars and authors, which caused them tremendous embarrassment and even legal trouble, and also got their publishers into difficulty. So, if you do save online documents in files of your own, that is, if you come across articles or book excerpts or other materials online that are interesting and useful for your research paper purposes, and you choose to save versions of those documents in files on your own computer, if you do this, be sure to mark and label those files very clearly. Anything that's borrowed, put quotation marks around it and include all the complete bibliographic information in the same file, including the author, the title, the date of publication, the source, all that information that you'll need later for a footnote or a bibliographic entry. And this will make it harder for you a few weeks later to look at the material and forget where it came from and end up inserting it into the paper without much revision as if you'd written it yourself. So be very careful about distinguishing between paraphrasing and actual quoting. Be sure you know which you're doing at any given time and do each one correctly. A second way, besides paraphrasing, of citing research material is to quote a sentence or more from the source. You would do this when a particular writer that you're reading has stated something in a way that's unusually apt, interesting, forceful, or thought-provoking. It's the kind of sentence or paragraph that makes you say, wow, I can't imagine how that idea could be stated any better. When you run across a passage like this in your research, you want to jot it down in your notes and be careful to precisely record every detail. Then, if the fact or idea belongs in your paper, you can quote one or more sentences word for word. Now, notice what you're doing here and what you're not doing. You're quoting a source out of appreciation for the fact that the source has stated an idea so well that it really can't be improved upon. You're not simply relying on the authority of the source to make a weak argument look stronger. In other words, you're not leaning on the fact that you're borrowing a sentence or two from Professor so-and-so who went to a famous university and whose work has been published by a major book publisher or a well-known journal, and you're not hoping that the prestige of the professor will make your work look better. The paper is still your responsibility, and the thesis that you're proposing has to stand on its own 2 feet. You're simply borrowing the words of another writer, not as a way of abdicating that responsibility, but simply to acknowledge the contribution of someone who has worked the same scholarly ground before you. Now, how should you handle a direct quotation in your paper? Here are some tips. Not every student knows how to do this properly. Learning how to do it is an important part of mastering the art of writing a research paper. First, if the quotation is short, which means less than 5 lines of type as it appears in your paper, with a short quotation, simply build it into your paragraph of text. Always introduce the quotation with words of your own. Don't just take the quoted words, put quotation marks around them, and stick them into your paper with no explanation. That's very confusing and doesn't look right, and your teacher will wonder what's going on. And I've certainly seen students do this in their research papers. Avoid that mistake. Remember, you are the author of the paper, and it's being written in your voice. It expresses your ideas, and it's your work. So when you quote another writer, you introduce him or her and put the quotation into context, so that the reader always knows exactly who is speaking at any given moment. Here's an example. Let's suppose you're working on a paper about Charles Darwin, the scientist who first developed the idea of evolution by natural selection. And as we've discussed elsewhere in this series, Darwin delayed publishing his theory for many years while he agonized over the implications of the theory. You might write a paper that focuses on the painful emotions that were created in Darwin by the social and political controversy that his theory stirred up once it was published. So you'd focus perhaps in your paper for a history of science course on the emotional and personal reactions of Darwin to this unwanted controversy. Now, to demonstrate what Darwin went through and to show how directly and deeply this controversy affected him, you decide that you're going to quote from a letter which you discovered in your research. This is a letter that was written to Darwin in 1871 by his friend, St. George Mivart, who was a fellow scientist. And in this letter, which you encounter in your reading, Mivart writes, quote, "The acceptance of your views," meaning Darwin's views about evolution, "the acceptance of your views means, with many, the abandonment of belief in God and in the immortality of the soul, together with future rewards and punishments. God grant we in England may not be approaching a religious decay at all similar to that in the middle of the 18th century in France, which Frenchmen are now paying for in blood and tears." End quote. So here is Darwin's friend Mivart writing to Darwin and saying, you know, people who accept your views about evolution, many of them think this means they have to give up believing in God and in the immortality of the soul. And I'm afraid that what's going to happen in England as a result of this will be a decay, a breakdown of religion, just like what happened in France 100 years ago. And wouldn't this be terrible? So here is a friend of Darwin writing directly to Darwin, talking about the terrible effects that he is afraid the theory of evolution might be having on the morality and the religion of England. You could imagine the terrible effect emotionally that this letter might have had on Darwin himself. So you decide that you want to quote the first sentence of this passage and that you're going to use it to make the point that Darwin must have been very upset to have a friend writing to warn him of the evil effects that his theory was having on the morality and religious beliefs of others in England. Here would be one good way of quoting this sentence in your paper. This would be a passage from your paper in which you use a quotation or an excerpt from the Mivart letter. Here's what it might read. Darwin's fears that his theory would provoke religious controversy proved to be well-founded. Even his friends expressed concern about the impact of Darwin's ideas on religious belief. For example, in an 1871 letter, Darwin's friend and fellow scientist, St. George Mivart, wrote him to warn that, quote, "The acceptance of your views means with many the abandonment of belief in God and in the immortality of the soul, together with future rewards and punishments," end quote. It's easy to imagine the dismay that Darwin must have felt to receive a message like this, given the fact that Darwin had been so eager to avoid controversy of any kind. So this is an excerpt from your paper in which you use the Mivart quote. Notice how the quotation from Mivart's letter is embedded in a sentence that explains where it came from, when it was written, who said it, and why the sentence is being quoted. When we read the paper and read this paragraph, we understand exactly who said the words that are being quoted and what the reason is that the writer of the paper is quoting those words. It's to illustrate the controversy in which Darwin found himself caught up, and to help the reader understand how upset Darwin must have been by this controversy. Notice, too, how the sentence is constructed to lead naturally and grammatically into the quotation, so the whole paragraph reads smoothly and gracefully. Naturally, the exact words of the quotation from the letter are contained within quotation marks, and a footnote is attached to the end of the sentence. The footnote itself will tell the reader where you found the sentence from the letter by St. George Mivart. Step back and take a look at the effect that the entire paragraph has. It's almost as if you were giving a little talk or a lecture on your subject. From time to time, while giving this talk, you want to quote words from some book or article. And when you do so, you want to let your audience know that you're doing that. If you were giving this in the form of a lecture, you might even pick up a copy of the book or article and say to your audience, "Let me read you a sentence or two from an interesting and relevant piece of writing." You'd open the book or article and you would offer the quotation. In effect, you're doing the same thing in your research paper. You're telling your audience, "I'm about to quote from another writer. Here's why. Notice how important this is for my argument. See how it fits in. Here's the quotation," and you then offer the quotation. So you don't simply plop the quoted words into your paper with no explanation or context. Instead, you explain where it came from, and of course, then you provide the complete bibliographic information in a footnote and/or bibliographic entry. At the end of the quotation, you'll cite its exact source, providing the bibliographic information that a reader would need to find the source himself. In other words, the reader might want to find the original letter written by St. George Mivart if the reader, for example, was doing some additional research on Darwin and his life. He might want to be able to find that letter himself and read more about the relationship between the two men. So giving that bibliographic information is important as a scholar for that reason. And as we'll discuss in the next program, there are a few different ways of doing this, providing this bibliographic information, depending on the citation style that your teacher has asked you to use. You might insert a footnote number in the text, as we did in our example, with the citation information at the bottom of the page, or you might insert a brief parenthetical reference to the complete bibliographic item which appears at the end of the paper. Those are two of the alternative ways of providing this data, and we'll discuss this in much more detail in our next program in the series. If the quotation runs longer than 4 lines, you'll handle it as what we call a block quotation, rather than simply inserting it into an existing paragraph, as we did in this last example. When you have a block quotation of 5 lines or more, you'll start a new paragraph and indent it about 1 inch, which is about twice as much as a normal paragraph would be indented. Thereby, you'll be setting off the block quotation from the surrounding text. It will be obvious to the reader that a block quotation is being offered because it's indented more than the ordinary material. Don't put quotation marks around the material that you're quoting in a block quotation. The fact that it's separated typographically from the rest of your text will be enough to tell the reader this is a quotation. But otherwise, you would handle the block quotation more or less the same as a shorter quotation. You'll introduce it with a few words of your own so that the reader understands exactly what the context and purpose of the quotation is. And of course, you'll also provide a source citation at the end of the quotation. Here's an example of how you would incorporate a long block quotation into your paper. Let's stick for this purpose with our paper about Darwin. Perhaps you found another quotation from a letter by Darwin's friend, St. George Mivart, that you want to use to illustrate further the controversy that was stirred up by Darwin's theory of evolution. Now, in this case, the excerpt that you want to quote is a little longer than in the previous example, and as you'll see, it also serves a somewhat different purpose. In this case, the quotation from Mivart shows that much of the controversy about evolution was caused not by Darwin himself, but by some of Darwin's more extreme followers, especially another scientist named Thomas H. Huxley. Here's an example of how you might introduce a long block quotation from Mivart and fit it into your paper. So this is an excerpt from your paper which will incorporate the Mivart quotation. Making matters worse for Darwin, some of his most zealous followers, such as Thomas H. Huxley, were actually eager to use his theory to stir up religious controversies. causing Darwin enormous anxiety and pain. Again, Darwin's friendships were strained, as illustrated by this passage from another letter by Myriad, : "For my part, I shall never feel anything but gratitude and sincere esteem for the author of Natural Selection, but I heartily execrate some who made use of that theory simply as a weapon of offense against higher interests and as a means of impeding man's advance towards his end, whatever may have been his origin." So we see how in this quotation, Myriad is saying that he has nothing but gratitude and sincere esteem for Darwin, the author of Natural Selection, but that he hates, he execrates some of those, like Huxley, who use the theory to attack the higher interests of mankind and to destroy religion. So in this excerpt, Myriad is saying to Darwin, I don't blame you for what your friends have done, your supposed friends, have done with your theory and used it to create controversy. So we have this longish quote from a Myriad letter that we build into the paper as a block quotation. Notice a couple of features about the block quotation. First, notice how the quotation is indented and is thereby set off from the rest of the text. You can tell at a glance that this is a quotation from some other source, not part of the student's own writing. Notice that no quotation marks appear at the beginning or end of the block quotation. There are some quotation marks within the block quotation. Those are quotation marks that appeared in the original letter, and of course we reproduce them precisely. But we don't have to put quotation marks at the beginning or the end of the block quotation because the indentation shows that this is a quotation. And also notice how the original quotation from Myriad has been reproduced exactly. We've used, for example, the ampersand symbol in place of the usual word and the word man has been capitalized, which is unusual. That's not how the word is normally spelled today. Always copy a quotation precisely, even if that means reproducing what might be considered errors or what would be a non-standard style in contemporary writing. Most important, look at the sentence that precedes the block quotation. That sentence reads, "Again, Darwin's friendships were strained, as illustrated by this passage from another letter by Myriad, : Notice how this sentence introduces the quotation, explains where it comes from, and describes why the quotation appears. It's to illustrate how other people using Darwin's ideas to create controversy caused strain in Darwin's friendships and troubled him deeply. And the letter from Myriad helps to illustrate that. The introductory sentence tells us exactly why we're reading this quotation. The reader understands what the writer of the research paper is getting at, where the quotation came from, and why it's important. So this is the right way to handle quotations in your paper. Always provide in your own words a context that explains what you're quoting and why. Now, how often should you quote directly from other writers as opposed to paraphrasing them? It depends. As a general rule, you should avoid sprinkling your paper with too many quotations, especially long block quotations. You don't want to fall into the trap that some of my students committed years ago, making your paper look like nothing but a series of clippings from other people's work pasted together with brief phrases or sentences of your own. If you quote too frequently and too extensively, then the paper will no longer have your own voice. Instead, it will take on the voices of the people you're quoting, and it will just look like a collage of other people's work rather than being your own statement. As a rule of thumb, in a 10 to 15 page research paper, half a dozen direct quotations is probably enough. Well, that means you need to be selective. From all your research and reading, you want to just pick the 6 or 7 or 8 very best and most quotable sentences and paragraphs and tuck them into your paper where they belong, like cherries in a fruitcake, things that will add special flavor to the entire mixture without taking over. If you've chosen quotations well, they will please the reader and emphasize the most interesting and important points in your paper, rather than distracting from your own ideas. Now, there is an exception to this rule about not using too many direct quotations. If you're writing a paper that offers a detailed analysis, interpretation, or reaction to a specific text, you may need to quote that text more often than half a dozen times. For example, let's say you're taking an English class and you're writing a paper about the patterns of symbolism in Herman Melville's novel Moby Dick. It would probably be important to provide evidence and examples to illustrate your ideas about that symbolism, and so you would probably find yourself quoting sentences from Moby Dick many times in the paper, maybe 12, 15 times, or even more. On the other hand, our rule about being sparing with quotations would still apply to the use of secondary sources in such a paper. In other words, you wouldn't want to throw in a dozen quotations from other literary critics talking about Melville. Just a handful, five or six would be better. So if you are writing a detailed analysis of some other piece of writing, whether it's a novel by Herman Melville or, for example, the political writings of Malcolm X, if you're writing a detailed analysis of someone else's writing, then yes, you may need to quote that source person many times in the course of one paper. But otherwise, just a few direct quotations from other writers, half a dozen or so, is probably better than relying too much on outside voices. The third way of citing sources is to interweave selected words or phrases from an author that you've read into sentences of your own. Notice the difference here. We're not quoting an entire sentence or a paragraph. Instead, we're just picking a few words or phrases and building them into our own sentences for the effect that they bring. This is a good technique to use when there are specific bits of language that are worth borrowing from another writer, but when it's really not necessary to quote an entire sentence or more. Now, naturally, whenever you cite a source, including just a few words, you need to introduce an introductory phrase which makes it clear who you're citing and why, what is the importance of the words or phrases that you are quoting. It takes practice to learn how to do this, how to drop someone else's words into a sentence of your own, how to provide a reference, and then make it all read smoothly and naturally. So start practicing now and you begin to develop this skill. It's a useful one for any time you're writing research papers now and in the years to come. Here's another example, an example of how we do this. Quote just a few words and insert those words into a sentence of our own and make the whole thing read smoothly and clearly. Once again, we'll go back to the relationship between Charles Darwin and his friend Mivart. Here's a quotation from your paper in which a few words from a source are inserted into a sentence of your own. Here's how the passage might read. Most scientists, perhaps, look forward to appreciation and acclaim when they introduce an important new idea, but not Darwin. Darwin was deeply worried about the reaction that his radical new theory might provoke from the public, and in particular from religious leaders. According to a note in his diary, Darwin commented to his friend, St. George Mivart, that when his book would be published, he expected to receive, quote, universal disapprobation, if not execution. End quote. So obviously the point of this quotation, in this case, it comes from Darwin's diary rather than from Mivart himself, but it's addressed to Mivart. This particular quotation makes the point that Darwin was afraid that when his theory was published, he would receive universal disapprobation, which means disapproval or condemnation, if not execution. And he's probably exaggerating or perhaps even joking a bit about the idea that he might be killed for his beliefs. But clearly Darwin was very nervous about publishing the theory, and that's exactly what these few words from his diary serve to bring home to the reader very clearly. You can see how simply paraphrasing this idea would be less effective than quoting the actual words from Darwin's diary. If you simply said in your paper that Darwin expected his ideas to be unpopular, that would be fine, but notice how much impact Darwin's specific words have. Universal disapprobation, if not execution. He states it in such strong emotional language that the words are very interesting and powerful and make a good quotation within our own sentence. This is why the student working on this paper picked out those words from his research and decided to quote them. And this is a good example of how to do it, how to build a few words from a quoted source into a sentence of your own. Notice that only the most important words from the source are quoted. All the additional verbiage that appeared around those words in Darwin's diary All of that has simply been omitted because it's really not necessary. Just the important words that carry the emotional clout are retained. And notice again how the surrounding sentence explains the significance of the quoted words so that they have a clear meaning for the reader. The surrounding sentence says, according to a note in his diary, which tells us exactly where the words come from, Darwin commented to his friend St. George Mivart that when his book would be published, he expected to receive, quote, universal disapprobation, if not execution. So the sentence is written to explain exactly what Darwin was referring to, what he thought would happen when his book was published. So we understand exactly what Darwin was saying, and we also see why the quotation has been offered to us. It helps us understand the anxiety that Darwin felt as the approaching publication of his theory drew near. As you can see, it's important to craft your sentences so that the words or phrases that you're borrowing fit comfortably into them. The grammar and the sentence structure must be shaped so that the borrowed words or phrases make sense in the new context and create a sentence that reads smoothly. And again, this takes practice. One final point about quotations. You will sometimes see in scholarly writing the Latin word sic, S-I-C, used with a quotation. Sic means literally thus. It's used with a quotation to tell the reader that a word or phrase or spelling in the quotation that might appear to be an error is not an error. It's not a typo. That the words appear just that way in the original source document. So the word sic is telling the reader, yes, this is the way the quotation originally read. It's not a mistake. The word sic would be placed within square brackets, which shows that it's not part of the original quotation. Whenever you are inserting words or a comment like sic into a quotation and you're injecting your own voice in the middle of quoted words, you need to use square brackets around the inserted words. And that tells the reader clearly that the interpolated material comes from you and not from the original quotation. Parentheses or any other kind of bracket doesn't have the same effect. It's got to be square brackets to illustrate that you are injecting your own voice in the middle of the quotation. So you might use sic when you're quoting a source that contains some kind of factual error, or you could use it when quoting a document that contains a writing error like a grammar or spelling mistake. However, sic should be used sparingly. In most cases, you can avoid having to use it by choosing the words or sentences that you quote carefully and eliminating any portion that has a factual or writing mistake, unless you particularly want to point out the mistake for some reason. If you're quoting a document that contains many apparent mistakes, then you probably want to include a sentence explaining this fact rather than using sic repeatedly. For example, suppose you were quoting a diary written by a semi-literate individual. You might be quoting, for example, a diary by a Civil War soldier who wasn't an expert writing, but whose testimony about events that he witnessed in the war is interesting and important. And a diary excerpt like this might be filled with spelling and grammatical errors. Rather than inserting the word sic, you would write a sentence explaining the nature of the source and saying that you've reproduced the words of the original source precisely. The same might be true of a document written in archaic English that included many obsolete words and spellings. You would write an explanatory sentence rather than using sic. For example, you could have a sentence in your paper saying something like, in the following quotation, grammar, punctuation, and spelling reflect the Northumbrian dialect of the 13th century and have been reproduced as in the original. That way your reader will read the quotation, will not say, I wonder if that's really what they wrote, or if this is just a typo. The reader instead will note, this is the way it was originally written, and the writer has been careful to reproduce it precisely, including things that look like errors. As this program has shown, using ideas and information from your research in your paper is a challenging art. It's one that most students find it takes quite a bit of practice to master. As you do your research, notice how the scholarly books and papers that you read incorporate their research materials. Take a look at how the scholars that you're reading use quotations. how they cite the sources, how they paraphrase other writers that they find interesting or valuable, and how they incorporate both block quotations and other long quotations, as well as short quotations of just a few words into their own writing. Notice how they craft sentences that flow smoothly, incorporating words from outside sources in a way that reads easily and that makes it clear to the reader what the context of the original quotation is and why it's being cited in this new piece of writing. By looking at how good scholars use these techniques, you can develop a good feeling for the proper style of research-based writing, and you can imitate the best techniques used by successful and respected scholars. There remains one more major challenge for students in learning how to incorporate research materials into their papers, and that's the mechanical details of quoting, citing, and referencing research sources and creating a bibliography that captures all the necessary background information. We're going to tackle this challenge in the next program in our series. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.
If math problems leave you scratching your head, unsure of where to start and where to go, don't worry. Video-aided instruction can help even the most math-challenged students excel. Whether you're taking math in middle school, high school, or college, or simply brushing up on those forgotten skills, our comprehensive DVD review sets are the ultimate supplements to your textbook and classwork. We have programs for a whole range of skill levels, from basic math to algebra and trigonometry, from statistics to college-level calculus. Our intensive programs feature real teaching by real teachers. They're jam-packed with hours of hands-on problem solving and feature hundreds of practice questions, easy-to-follow explanations, and proven strategies. Visit us online at videoaidedinstruction.com for more information about our exciting programs that help take the mystery out of math.